In a tomb near Thebes, an artist mixed red paint and ruled a grid of squares across the wall before he drew a single line. 18 squares from the soles of the feet to the hairline. The knee on square 6, the shoulders on square 16. That was around 1900 BC. 18 centuries later, a craftsman cutting a memorial stone at Saqqara in the 10th year of the reign of Cleopatra ruled a grid of his own. The squares had been resized once in all that time. The body they described had barely moved. Rome did not exist when that system was written down. Rome ruled the Mediterranean before Egypt stopped using it. Sit with that for a second, because it is stranger than it first sounds. This is not a style that happened to last. It is not nostalgia or a tradition kept up on holidays. It is a working technical standard, taught in workshops, handed from master to apprentice, used to lay out the walls of temples and the sides of coffins, and it outlived the spoken language of the people who invented it. It outlived their independence. It was still in daily professional use when Julius Caesar sailed up the Nile. Every documentary on this channel begins with one simple idea: curiosity. If you've enjoyed exploring history with me, I'd love to invite you to become part of this journey. My next milestone is 20,000 subscribers, and reaching it would mean more than I can express. Thank you for helping this channel grow, one story at a time. If you haven't subscribed yet, I'd truly appreciate your support. It would mean the world to me. Every civilization has continuity. This is something else, which raises the question this whole story exists to answer. How does a society get like that? What has to happen to a group of human beings for them to arrive at a way of doing things and then hold on to it for 3,000 years while empires rise and burn out around them? The answer is not that Egyptians were unusually stubborn, and it is certainly not that they lacked imagination, because they did not. The answer starts with a river that kept a schedule. Every summer, monsoon rains fell on the Ethiopian highlands, more than 1,000 miles south of the Egyptian heartland. Those rains fed the Blue Nile and the Atbara, which fed the main channel, which carried the runoff north, through Nubia, through the granite narrows at Aswan, and out into the long green ribbon of the Egyptian valley. The water arrived in late June or early July. It rose through August. It peaked in September. It fell back through October and November, and then the fields lay exposed again, soaked and covered in a fresh layer of silt that had been scraped off a mountain range on the other side of a continent. That silt was the entire basis of Egyptian agriculture. Fine, dark, mineral-rich, and it arrived free every year, without anyone having to do anything except be standing there when it came. Now hold that picture and look east, because there was another great river civilization in the ancient world, and it got a completely different deal. Mesopotamia sat between the Tigris and the Euphrates. Those rivers flooded too, but they flooded in spring, close to harvest, rather than before planting, which is the worst possible moment. They flooded violently. They changed course. They broke their banks and erased settlements. The volume swung wildly from year to year, and there was no way to know in advance whether a given spring would bring water or ruin. Two civilizations, both built on flooding rivers, and the rivers behaved nothing alike. Look at what each of them believed, and you can see the water in it. Mesopotamian religion is soaked in anxiety. The gods are capricious, badly coordinated, occasionally hostile. Their great flood story is a story about divine irritation escalating into an attempt to wipe out the human race. The universe, in Mesopotamian thought, is not on your side and does not owe you an explanation. Egyptian religion is obsessed with return, with cycles, with things going away and coming back. The sun dies in the west and is reborn in the east. The god Osiris is murdered, dismembered, reassembled, restored to a kind of life. The flood recedes and the flood comes again. The emotional key of Egyptian religion is not terror. It is confidence that the pattern will hold, wrapped around a very sharp fear of what happens if it does not. None of that is coincidence. These are people describing the world they actually lived in, and the description went deeper than theology. It went into the vocabulary. They did not call their country Egypt. That word reaches us through Greek, from a name for the temple complex at Memphis. They called it Kemet, the Black Land. The black was the silt. The black was the strip of soil along the river that could be farmed, in places no more than a few miles wide, opening out in the north into the fan of channels and marshes we call the delta. On a satellite image you can still see it, a green thread running through a continent of sand with a flower blooming at the top. Somewhere between 95 and 99% of Egypt's land area was, and still is, uninhabitable desert. Essentially, the entire population of ancient Egypt lived on that thread, and the desert had its own name, Deshret, the Red Land. So the fundamental division of the Egyptian world was built into the language before anyone wrote a word of theology. Black and red, life and death, order and disorder, the place where things grow and the place where they do not. In parts of the valley, the boundary between them is so abrupt you can photograph it. Cultivated field on one side, bare sand on the other, no transition at all. You can stand with a foot in each. A civilization that lives on a line like that is going to think in opposites, and Egyptian thought is relentlessly, almost compulsively dualistic. Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt, the two lands, two crowns, two banks of the river, the living on the east where the sun rises, the dead buried on the west where it sets. That habit of mind, the instinct to sort the world into balanced pairs, ends up shaping their politics, their art, and what they believed happened to you after you died. But the deepest consequence of the river was not philosophical, it was practical, and it is the thing that starts the machine. A flood that comes on schedule is a flood you can prepare for, and a flood whose size varies within a known range is a flood you can measure. So they measured it. At key points along the river, the Egyptians cut stairways and shafts into the bank, calibrated in cubits, so that as the water rose, an official could read the level off the wall the way you read a dipstick. We call them nilometers. What they produced was a number, and that number was the single most valuable piece of economic intelligence in the ancient world. Because flood height predicted harvest size, a high flood watered more land and left more silt, which meant more grain. A low flood meant thin fields and hunger. A flood that came in too high tore out irrigation works and drowned villages, which was a disaster of its own kind. So the reading told you, months in advance, roughly how much food the country was going to produce, which told you how much you could tax, which meant the central authority could plan. Read that again, because the entire civilization is folded up inside it. The river gave Egypt an early warning system, and nobody else in the ancient world had one. A Mesopotamian city could not know in March what its harvest would look like in July. An Egyptian scribe could take a measurement in August and know a great deal about the year ahead. They took those records seriously. The Palermo stone, a fragmentary slab of royal annals from the Old Kingdom, runs through the early reigns year by year, listing the events that mattered, and alongside them, the height of the inundation. That is what an Egyptian government thought belonged in stone, next to the deeds of kings, the water level. And once you are tracking a cycle that precisely, you need a way to count it. The Egyptians built a civil calendar of 365 days, 3 seasons of 4 months each, 12 months of 30 days, and then 5 extra days stacked at the end of the year to make up the difference. The seasons were named for what the river was doing. Akhet, the inundation, when the water is on the fields and farming is impossible, which means a large share of the rural workforce has nothing agricultural to do. Remember that one. It matters enormously later. Peret, the emergence, when the water pulls back, the land comes out from under it, and everything gets planted. Shemu, the harvest, when the grain is cut and threshed and hauled to the granary, and the country waits for the water to come back. That is a calendar, derived directly from a hydrological cycle. Nothing abstract about it. Every Egyptian knew what month it was by looking at the river. It was also, for its era, remarkably clean engineering. Even blocks, with the awkward remainder swept into a single heap at the end of the year instead of scattered through it, which is more than you can say for the intercalated months and manual corrections other ancient calendars needed. It was not perfect. The true solar year runs about a quarter day longer, so the Egyptian civil calendar drifted forward against the seasons by roughly a day every 4 years, and over centuries that drift became substantial. It is one of the main reasons Egyptian date records are such a headache for modern chronologists. But as a piece of practical design, built in the 3rd millennium BC, it is a serious achievement, and its skeleton is still hanging on your wall. None of this measuring and counting would have been worth the trouble, though, if there had been nothing to count. What made it worth the trouble was surplus. Reliable flooding plus fertile silt meant that Egyptian farmers, working with simple tools, could grow substantially more grain than they needed to eat. And surplus is the raw material of civilization, but surplus, on its own, does nothing at all. Grain rots. Grain gets eaten by rodents. Grain is heavy and awkward to move. A surplus only turns into power when somebody builds an apparatus to collect it, store it, guard it, count it, and hand it back out. That apparatus is the state, which is worth being precise about, because it cuts against the picture most people carry around. The Egyptian state did not begin as a war machine. There is no sign of a militarized early Egyptian society, no fortress cities, no large standing army, nothing resembling the walled competition of the Mesopotamian city-states. Egypt in the 3rd millennium is not primarily a place that conquers. It is a place that stores. What the early Egyptian government mainly does is inventory. It establishes how much grain exists, where it is, who owes what, and where it has to go. Its characteristic building is a granary. Its characteristic official is not a general. It is a man with a reed pen and a sheet of papyrus, sitting cross-legged, writing down numbers. So why did all of that land in one pair of hands instead of 100? Geography again. And this time, it is the shape of the river rather than its schedule. The Nile is a highway that runs in both directions at once. The current flows north, so a boat can simply drift downstream. The prevailing wind blows south, so a boat can raise a sail and go back up against the current. That is an extraordinary gift, and it means Egypt had reliable two-way transport along its entire length before anyone had built a road worth the name. The consequence is that a valley, more than 500 miles long, could be administered as a single unit. Messages moved, grain moved, officials moved, armies, once there were armies, moved. A Mesopotamian king could not comfortably govern a rival city 100 miles away. An Egyptian king could reach the far end of his country by boat in a few weeks. Narrow, linear, connected, walled on both sides by desert, and blocked in the south by rapids at the cataracts. Egypt was close to the easiest large territory to hold in the ancient world. Put all of it together, and you do not just get a country. You get an idea. You live in a place where the world runs on a schedule. The flood comes. The sun comes. The seasons turn. Grain grows, is counted, is stored, is given out. There is a correct way for things to be, and most of the time, things are that way. The Egyptians had a word for that correct way, Maat. It gets translated as truth, or order, or justice, or balance, or rightness, and no single one of those is enough, because it is all of them simultaneously. Ma'at is how the universe is supposed to run. It covers the movement of the sun, and the honesty of a market transaction, and the height of the flood, and whether a judge takes a bribe. It is physics and ethics and law at once. And the Egyptians did not experience those as separate departments. Ma'at was also a goddess, usually shown as a woman with a single ostrich feather on her head. And that feather is going to reappear in one of the most famous images this civilization ever produced. When it does, it will be sitting on a scale. The opposite of Ma'at was Isfet, chaos, disorder, injustice, falsehood. And here is the part of Egyptian thinking that explains an enormous amount of their behavior. Isfet was never defeated. It was held back. It pressed constantly against the edges of the ordered world. And every single day, it had to be pushed back again through ritual, through administration, through the correct performance of the correct actions. Order was not the natural state of things. Order was a daily achievement, which handed the Egyptian king his job description. Not conqueror, not lawgiver in the Mesopotamian sense. The pharaoh's defining, non-negotiable function was to maintain Ma'at. He was the hinge between the human world and the cosmic one, and if he performed correctly, the sun rose and the river came, and the grain grew. He fed the gods through temple ritual, and the gods held the universe together, which is a magnificent arrangement for a king, right up until the river fails. Because if the flood is the proof that the system works, then a failed flood is not merely an agricultural crisis. It is a theological one, visible to every farmer in the valley, and what it says is that the man in the palace is either not doing his job or cannot. Hold that thought. It detonates in about 700 years. So here is what this story actually argues, and everything from this point on is evidence for it. Egypt did not simply have a culture. Egypt developed something closer to an operating system. A river that behaved predictably produced surplus, which produced measurement, which produced writing and a calendar and a bureaucracy, which produced a centralized state, which was justified by an ideology that treated stability itself as sacred and made the maintenance of stability the highest duty of the highest office in the land. Once that locked into place, it ran for 3,000 years. It survived invasion, it survived civil war, it survived conquest by people who did not speak the language, more than once. It survived its own kings trying to take it apart. And it changed, constantly, which is the part that gets flattened in the popular picture. Egyptian art moved. Their literature moved, their theology moved, their politics moved, and a specialist can date an object to within a few decades on style alone. The stillness is a trick of scale. Stand far enough back from anything and it stops moving. But the changes were nearly always changes inside the framework, rather than to it. The grid got resized. The grid did not get thrown away. There were 3 moments when the framework itself came apart, or came very close. The first was a climate crisis around 2200 BC that broke the government and forced Egypt to reconsider what a king was even for. The second was a military occupation by foreigners carrying technology Egypt did not have, which turned an inward-looking country into an empire. The third was a king who tried to shut down the gods. Those 3 ruptures are the spine of this story. Everything else is what the machine did in between, and it starts with 2 crowns. In 1898, at a site in southern Egypt called Hierakonpolis, archaeologists working through the remains of an early temple found a slab of dark siltstone about 2 feet tall, shield-shaped, carved on both faces. It is called the Nama palette, and it is one of the most heavily analyzed objects in the entire history of archaeology. The shape is the first clue. It is a cosmetic palette, the kind of object used for grinding pigment, of a type that had been common for centuries before. Ordinary ones are small and functional. This one is enormous, far too large and far too finely carved for anybody to have actually ground eye paint on it. It is a ceremonial version of a household object, made to be displayed in a temple. Then there are the faces. On one side, a king strides forward, gripping a kneeling captive by the hair, one arm raised with a mace, wearing a tall white conical crown. Above the captive, A falcon holds a rope threaded through a human head that emerges from a strip of land sprouting papyrus. Below the king's feet, two more figures sprawl, dead or fleeing. On the other side, the same king walks in procession behind standard bearers toward two neat rows of decapitated bodies with their heads placed between their legs. And here, he wears a different crown, a red one, with a distinctive curl rising from the front. In the middle of that face, two long-necked beasts have their necks intertwined by handlers, forming the circular depression that would hold pigment on a working palette. The white crown belongs to Upper Egypt, the southern valley. The red crown belongs to Lower Egypt, the northern delta. One man, two crowns, one object. For more than a century, this has been read as the founding document of the Egyptian state, the unification of the two lands, caught at the moment it happened, by a southern king named Narmer who marched north, defeated the delta, and became the first ruler of a single Egypt. And this is where a good version of this story has to slow down, because that reading has a problem. The palette is not a photograph. It is a monument, made by the winning side, using a visual language that was already conventional by the time it was carved. The pose of the king with the raised mace, holding an enemy by the hair, is not a snapshot of a particular fight. It is a formula. It appears before Narmer, and it goes on appearing on Egyptian temple walls for the next 3,000 years, applied to kings who never fought the battles shown, right down into the Roman period. What it means is that the king dominates chaos. It does not mean that this happened on a Tuesday. So among Egyptologists, there is real, live disagreement about what this object records. Some read it as commemorating an actual military campaign. Others read it as an ideological statement, a declaration that this king embodies the unity of the two lands, which may be summarizing a process that took generations, rather than a single afternoon. Some read it as both at once, a real event dressed so thoroughly in symbolic clothing that the two can no longer be separated. The archaeology pushes in the same direction. Distinctive southern material culture shows up in the north well before Narmer, spread across a long stretch of time, which looks less like an invasion and more like a slow expansion of influence. There were kings before Narmer, sometimes labeled Dynasty Zero, with their own tombs and their own names. The state did not switch on, it accumulated, and there is a naming puzzle nobody has fully solved, because later Egyptian tradition, and the Greek historians who inherited it, credited the founding of the unified kingdom to a king called Menes, and whether Menes is Narmer, or Narmer's successor Aha, or a legendary composite assembled centuries after the fact, is still argued over. None of which makes the palette less important. It makes it more interesting. What survives is not a record of the founding. What survives is the founding myth, carved close enough to the event that we cannot cleanly pull the two apart. That problem is going to recur, so it is worth naming out loud now. Almost everything that survives from ancient Egypt was produced by the state or by the elite, for public display, with a purpose. Reading it means constantly asking who made this, for whom, and what were they trying to achieve. The moments when we get something else, a private letter, a work log, a complaint scratched onto a limestone flake, are rare and precious, and this story is going to hunt for them at every opportunity. Which is why, if you actually want to see where the Egyptian state came from, you should stop looking at the palette and look at a tomb. At Abydos, in a cemetery used by the earliest rulers, there is a tomb designated UJ. It dates to somewhere around 3200 BC, before Narmer. It is a multi-chambered brick structure, and it was full of imported wine jars, hundreds of them. Among the goods, excavators found small labels of bone and ivory, each pierced with a hole so it could be tied to something. On those labels are marks, signs. Some appear to indicate quantities, some appear to indicate places of origin, and some are still being argued over. Those labels are among the earliest writing found in Egypt. Stop and appreciate what that means. The first Egyptian writing we can point to is not a hymn, not a poem, not a prayer, not a king boasting about his victories. It is a tag on a jar recording where the contents came from and how much is in there. Writing in Egypt begins as inventory control. That is not a footnote. It is the origin story of the entire scribal civilization. Egyptian writing was invented, or at the very least, first deployed at scale, to solve a logistics problem. Somebody had a great deal of stuff, in a great many containers, from a great many places, and needed to keep track of it without relying on memory. Everything else came afterward. The literature came afterward. The religious texts came afterward. The elaborate hieroglyphic inscriptions carved on temple walls, which are what most people picture when they hear the word hieroglyph, came afterward. The warehouse produced the writing system, and that origin never entirely washed out. For all 3,000 years of this story, the Egyptian scribe stays fundamentally an administrator who can write, rather than an intellectual who happens to keep accounts. There is an open question here that deserves a straight answer instead of a confident one. Writing appears in Mesopotamia at broadly the same period, arguably slightly earlier, and it also emerges out of accounting. Whether Egypt developed writing independently or borrowed the idea while inventing its own signs is not settled. What is clear is that the Egyptian system is not a copy. The signs are Egyptian, the underlying language is Egyptian, and the structure differs from cuneiform. If anything was borrowed, it was the concept, not the content. Which brings us to the question every early state has to answer, one way or another. Why should one particular man be obeyed? Most answers are a version of because he is the strongest, or because the gods chose him, or because his father did it before him. Egypt gave a stronger answer than any of those. The king is not chosen by a god. The king is a god. In the earliest royal titles, the king is identified with Horus, the falcon god, not as a favorite of Horus, not as a servant of Horus. The living king is the earthly presence of Horus, and his name is written inside a rectangle representing the palace facade with a falcon perched on top, an image that says, "The god is in this building." The theology got elaborated over the centuries into a fuller version in which the living king is Horus, and when he dies he becomes Osiris, and his successor becomes the new Horus. Kingship is a role that gods occupy in sequence, and individual men are its temporary tenants. That idea is doing an enormous amount of political work, and it is worth spelling out how much. If the king is a god, rebellion is not politics, it is blasphemy. If the king maintains ma'at, obedience is not submission, it is participation in the correct functioning of the universe. If the king's ritual performance is what keeps the sun moving, then the taxes that fund the temples are not extraction, they are cosmic maintenance. It also solves the succession problem in a way most ancient states could not manage, because the role is permanent and divine, while the occupant is temporary and human. A king dies, the role continues, and the theology comes with a ready-made mechanism for handing it over. And it explains the single most conspicuous fact about ancient Egypt, the thing everybody knows before they know anything else: the building. If your king is a god, and if his transition after death is part of the machinery that keeps cosmic order intact, then his tomb is not a grave, it is infrastructure. It is the most important construction project the country can possibly undertake, because it is the apparatus by which the divine order gets renewed. Egypt is about to spend several centuries, and a quantity of labor that is genuinely difficult to hold in your head, acting on that belief. One last piece before the stone starts moving. The unified kingdom needed a capital, and it was placed at the hinge, at the point where the narrow valley of Upper Egypt opens out into the wide delta of Lower Egypt. The Egyptians founded a city. Tradition credits Menes. Its early name was Inebu Hedj, the White Walls. Later, it was Memphis. Look at a map and the logic is instant. A capital in the far south cannot control the delta. A capital in the delta cannot control the valley. Memphis sits on the seam, with the whole country within reach, in both directions along the river. And it stayed one of the most important cities in Egypt for the entire span of this story, through every collapse and every restoration, for roughly 3,000 years. Its cemetery stretches along the desert edge to the west, and that ground is where everything that comes next gets built. Saqqara. And within a few generations of the first unified kings, a man is going to walk out onto that ground with an idea nobody has ever had before, which is that an entire building could be made out of stone. His name was Imhotep, and he worked for a king called Djoser around 2670 BC. To understand what he did, you have to understand what a royal tomb looked like before he did it. The standard was a mastaba, from the Arabic word for bench, which is what they look like. A low rectangular block with sloping sides, built of mud brick, sitting over a shaft that dropped down to the actual burial chamber. Perfectly respectable, extremely normal. Egyptians had been building them for centuries, and the design had that quality that successful designs get, where nobody can quite imagine an alternative. What Imhotep built for Djoser at Saqqara started as a mastaba, and then it did not stop. He enlarged it, then he put a smaller one on top of it, then another, then he expanded the base and added more, until the thing standing on the desert edge was 6-step tiers rising around 200 feet into the air, and he built it out of stone. That is the part that changes everything. Stone had been used in Egypt for millennia, for tools and vessels and the occasional slab. Nobody had ever attempted a monumental building out of it. The step pyramid at Saqqara is, as far as anyone can demonstrate, the first large-scale cut stone structure on the planet. You can see the inexperience in it, which is one of the most human things about the whole complex. The blocks are small, roughly the size of the mud bricks they were replacing, because that is the unit the builders understood. In parts of the surrounding complex, Imhotep's masons carved stone into imitations of things that had always been made from something else. Stone columns shaped like bundled reeds, stone doors carved permanently open, hinges and all, doors that could never move, because they were never doors. A stone fence imitating a wooden fence. That is a workforce translating an entire architectural vocabulary into a new material, and translating it literally, because they had not yet worked out what stone wanted to be on its own terms. Give them a century and they will. The complex around the pyramid was enormous. A walled precinct roughly the size of a small town, filled with buildings that were often solid fill with false facades, structures meant to be present rather than entered. This was a machine for the king's afterlife, and its constituent parts needed to exist more than they needed to function. As for the man who designed it, Egypt did something with Imhotep it almost never did with anybody. It made him a god, not immediately. It took roughly 2,000 years, which tells you something about how long Egyptian memory ran. But by the late period, Imhotep was being worshipped as a deity of healing and wisdom, with temples and a cult, and the Greeks who arrived later identified him with their own god of medicine, Asclepius. A commoner, an architect and administrator, promoted after death into the company of the gods. In a civilization this rigid about hierarchy, that is close to unthinkable, and it happened exactly once at this scale. Djoser's pyramid has steps, because that is how it grew, stage by stage, an idea being worked out in public. The smooth-sided pyramid that everybody pictures took another century, and it was not achieved on the first attempt, or the second. The king who got there was Sneferu, and Sneferu built more stone than anyone in Egyptian history, including his son. He is the reason we can watch a technology being debugged in real time, because his failures are still standing in the desert, and you can go look at them. His first major project was at Meidum. It began as a step pyramid in the older tradition, and then, partway through, somebody decided to fill in the steps, and cast a smooth outer surface over the whole thing to make a true pyramid. Today, the Medum Pyramid is a strange tower rising out of an enormous mound of its own rubble. The outer casing came away. Exactly when it came away is argued about, and there are Egyptologists who think it happened much later rather than during construction, so this should not be presented as a collapse anybody watched. But whatever the timing, the structure did not hold its intended shape, and the reason appears to be that the smooth casing was resting on stepped courses rather than being properly integrated into the core. The second attempt is at Dashur, and it is the most eloquent building in Egypt. It starts climbing at an angle of roughly 54 degrees, steep, ambitious, dramatic, and then, somewhere around half height, the angle abruptly changes to about 43 degrees, and the pyramid finishes at a much shallower pitch. It looks exactly like what it is. Someone in charge of that project looked at the cracking in the chambers and the settling in the foundation and made a decision, mid-build, to stop doing what they were doing. It is called the Bent Pyramid, and it is a mid-course correction preserved at the scale of a mountain. Sneferu did not abandon the site. He started again a short distance north, and this time he began at the shallower angle, around 43 degrees from the ground up. That structure worked. It is called the Red Pyramid for the color of its stone, and it is the first successful true smooth-sided pyramid ever built. 3 enormous projects. One structure that lost its shape, one that had to be redesigned while it was going up, and one that finally solved the problem. Sneferu spent his reign learning how to do this, at a cost in labor that is difficult to comprehend, and he learned by getting it wrong. Hold on to that, because it is the necessary antidote to almost everything that gets said about the pyramids. These were not people operating on inherited perfect knowledge, or borrowed knowledge, or knowledge from anywhere other than their own hands. They were engineers with a hard problem, working at the limit of what they understood, making mistakes at enormous expense and correcting them. The evidence of the learning curve is sitting in the sand at Medum and Dashur, in the exact order it happened, and then Sneferu's son inherited a solved problem and did something absurd with it. Khufu built at Giza, on a limestone plateau north of Dashur, and what he built has been described so often that the numbers have gone numb. So take them slowly. Roughly 2.33 million blocks, something in the region of 6.5 million tons of stone, an original height of about 480 feet, a base covering more than 13 acres, laid out so accurately that the sides are aligned to the cardinal directions with an error measured in fractions of a degree, on a base that is leveled to within a couple of inches across its entire span. Built with copper tools, wood, rope, stone hammers, water, and human beings. No iron, no pulleys as we would recognize them, no wheel in any load-bearing role. It remained the tallest structure made by human hands for approximately 3,800 years. To put that in a shape you can feel, the Great Pyramid held that record for longer than the entire span from Khufu to the present day. It was passed, finally, by a medieval cathedral spire in Europe. So how do you do it? And more to the point, who does it? For most of modern history, the honest answer was that nobody knew, and the vacuum filled with everything from Herodotus to television programs about visitors from space. Then, in 2013, a French mission working at a place called Wadi al-Jarf on the Red Sea coast opened a set of storage galleries cut into the rock and found what had been left behind in them. Wadi al-Jarf was a harbor built for expeditions across to the Sinai for copper and turquoise. The galleries were where the boats were stored between voyages, disassembled and stacked. When the harbor was decommissioned, apparently around the time Khufu died, a team came to seal the galleries up, and in the process the paperwork got left in the gap between the sealing blocks. It sat there for 4,500 years in dry desert air. Pierre Tallet and Gregory Marouard, excavating in March 2013, found hundreds of papyrus fragments. They are the oldest inscribed papyri ever recovered from Egypt. Among them are accounts, laid out in ruled columns, tracking deliveries of bread, beer, grain, and meat to work crews. They function like a spreadsheet: what was needed, what arrived, what is still outstanding. And among them is a logbook kept by a middle-ranking official whose title translates roughly as inspector. His name was Merer. Merer ran a crew of around 200 men, and the surviving sections of his journal record their daily activity in the 26th year of Khufu's reign, which is very close to the end of it. Their assignment was hauling white limestone by boat from the quarries at Tura on the east bank, across the river to the construction site at Giza. The Egyptian week was 10 days, and Merer's team completed the round trip 2 or 3 times per week. They loaded, they crossed, they unloaded, they went back. Day after day, logged in his own hand, with the entries dated. This is a shipping manifest for the Great Pyramid. The detail that makes it click into place is the timing. Moving stone by water only works when there is water, and the water arrived on the schedule that everything in this story runs on. During Akhet, the inundation, the Nile spread out across the floodplain, and canals became navigable that were dry the rest of the year. A loaded barge could get close to the plateau, and during exactly that season, agricultural labor across the entire country had nothing to do because their fields were underwater. That is the connection this whole story has been building toward since the first minute. The flood that fed Egypt also delivered the stone and freed the workforce in the same months every year. The pyramids are, in a real sense, a product of the flood season. Merer also names his superior. He reports to a nobleman called Unkhaf, and Unkhaf is known from other sources as a half-brother of Khufu who served as vizier. So the chain of command runs from a boat captain through a royal prince to the king, and now we have a piece of it written down by the man at the bottom of that chain rather than the top. 2 honest notes, because this is the kind of find that gets oversold. Merer never states what the limestone is for. The site he delivers to is called Akhet Khufu, the horizon of Khufu, which is generally understood to be the Great Pyramid complex, and the dating and the location and the material all line up. But the inference is an inference, and specialists have been careful to mark where the document stops and the interpretation begins. Second, this is the fine white casing stone from Tura, the outer skin, not the bulk core masonry, which came from quarries on the plateau itself. Merer's crew were finishing the building, not raising it. Still, for the first time, there is a named man with a job, writing down what he did at work on the largest construction project of the ancient world, which leaves the other question: who moved the rest of it, and under what conditions? Since 1988, Mark Lehner and Ancient Egypt Research Associates have been excavating a site south of the Sphinx, behind an enormous stone barrier that the excavators nicknamed the Wall of the Crow. In Arabic, the settlement is Hayt el Ghurab. Radiocarbon dates put it squarely in the reigns of Khufu, Khafre, and Menkaure, the 3 kings whose pyramids stand on the plateau above. It is not a camp, it is a planned town. There are long, narrow galleries that appear to have housed a rotating labor force. There are bakeries, on an industrial scale, with the bread molds still in the deposits. There are breweries, because beer was not a luxury in Egypt, it was a daily staple and a significant source of calories. There is a copper workshop for making and repairing the tools that cut the stone. There are storerooms and administrative buildings, the physical fabric of a supply operation, and there is the garbage, which is where it gets specific. The animal bone from the site includes cattle, sheep, and goat, in quantities that surprised the people digging it up. The zooarchaeologist working the material, Richard Redding, found that much of the cattle bone came from young animals, under 2 years old, and disproportionately male, that is prime beef. That is not what you feed people you do not care about. And the volume implies that livestock was being raised on estates elsewhere in Egypt and driven or shipped to Giza, specifically to feed this workforce. Then, in 1990, a tourist riding near the plateau stumbled over a buried wall, and the excavation that followed uncovered a cemetery. Not a royal one, the workers' own. Hundreds of graves, plus dozens of larger tombs for people who were evidently supervisors. The bodies were buried in proper Egyptian fashion, in the fetal position, oriented according to religious convention, with jars of supplies for the afterlife. Some of the tombs carry inscriptions naming the occupant and his title. The skeletons carry something else. There are healed fractures, set properly, and knitted straight. There is evidence of surgical intervention, including amputations where the patient clearly survived and went on living afterward. Put that together with the graffiti that George Reisner recorded early in the 20th century, marks left by work gangs on blocks in places the public was never meant to see. The gangs had names, and the names are not what you would expect from a forced labor camp. One reads as the Friends of Khufu. Another, attached to the third pyramid, translates roughly as the Drunkards of Menkaure. Those are the names of teams. Teams that competed. Teams with an identity and a bit of swagger about it. So the slave story, which most people absorbed somewhere without noticing, does not survive contact with the ground. It goes back at least to Herodotus, writing more than 2,000 years after the fact, at a distance from the events comparable to a modern journalist reporting on the Roman Empire based on local gossip. It was then reinforced by centuries of religious tradition and finally cemented by film. Being precise about it matters, because the correction can swing too far in the other direction. There was slavery in ancient Egypt, and there was certainly compulsory labor, a duty owed to the state that ordinary people could be called up for, and that only the privileged could buy their way out of. Nobody is claiming this was a volunteer project with competitive wages. But conscripted is not the same as enslaved, and the men who built the pyramids were housed in a purpose-built town, fed prime beef, treated by physicians when they broke, buried with rites in sight of the monument, and organized into named crews that were proud of themselves. Which tells you what the Great Pyramid actually is. It is not primarily a feat of engineering, though the engineering is remarkable. It is a feat of administration. The truly staggering achievement at Giza is that somebody worked out how to grow surplus grain across 500 miles of river valley, tax it, ship it, store it, convert it into bread and beer at industrial volume, distribute it on a schedule to thousands of people in a purpose-built settlement, rotate that workforce so the fields still got planted, coordinate quarrying at multiple sites, time the heavy transport to the flood, and keep the whole apparatus running for 2 decades without it falling apart. Everything in the first part of this story was building the capability to do exactly that. The nilometer, the calendar, the granary, the scribe. The pyramid is what that system looks like when you point all of it at a single object, which brings the scribe to the front of the picture, where he stays for the next 3,000 years. The man with the reed pen is the load-bearing element of the Egyptian state. He assesses the fields, records the yield, tallies the storehouse, issues the rations, logs the deliveries, drafts the letters, and keeps the accounts that make all coordination possible. Without him, the surplus is just grain sitting in the dark. And he is rare. How rare is genuinely uncertain, and the honest answer is a range rather than a number. Some of the most cited estimates put full literacy at around 1% of the population, though other Egyptologists argue for something more like 5 to 10%. And analysis of the papyri from a single Middle Kingdom town has suggested that urban literacy in that particular place might have been closer to 15. The figure varies by period, by region, and above all by whether you are counting a town or a farming village. What is not in doubt is the shape of the thing. The overwhelming majority of Egyptians could not read, and the ability to do so was the door into everything. So a scribal education was the single most valuable asset a family could give a son. Egyptian schoolboys copied out texts that hammered the point relentlessly, comparing the scribe's clean hands and dry seat with the misery of every other trade. And the message was not subtle, because it did not need to be. Learn this, and you will never carry anything heavy again. The reed pen was a class escalator, and for most of Egyptian history, it was very nearly the only one, all of which describes a system operating at the peak of its powers. So it is worth looking at what that system reserved for itself, because it is about to become the thing that breaks. In the last decades of the 5th dynasty, around 2350 BC, a king named Unas was buried in a modest pyramid at Saqqara, modest by Giza standards. Nothing about its exterior competes with what Sneferu and Khufu had done 3 centuries earlier, and by this period, royal pyramids had gotten noticeably smaller. The inside is a different matter. The walls of the burial chamber are covered, floor to ceiling, in columns of carved hieroglyphs. These are the pyramid texts, and they are the oldest substantial body of religious writing to survive from anywhere in the world. Spells, invocations, ritual formulas, and instructions, all directed at one purpose, which is getting the dead king through the transition and out the other side. They tell him what to say, they identify him with Osiris and with the sun, they give him routes, passwords, and the means to travel. They are also, and this is the part that matters for what comes next, carved inside a king's tomb. The picture that emerges from the Old Kingdom evidence is that this elaborate textual machinery for the afterlife appears in royal burials and not in anybody else's. Whether that reflects what people actually believed, or only what people were permitted to display, is one of the genuinely contested questions in the field, and this story is going to come back and take that argument apart properly, because the standard version of it is more confident than the evidence allows. But at face value, standing in Unas's burial chamber in 2350 BC, the arrangement looks stark. The king goes through. The king becomes a god. Everybody else is buried near him, and hopes that proximity is worth something. That is the deal. The king holds up the sky, the state feeds the country, the scribe counts the grain, the river comes on time, and the arrangement has held for more than 600 years. It is about to stop holding, because a few decades after Unas was sealed into that chamber, the provincial governors were quietly becoming a power in their own right. The crown was giving away tax-exempt land it would never get back. One king was going to sit on the throne for so long that his own succession disintegrated behind him, and 1,000 miles to the south, in the highlands that fed the Nile, the rain was about to stop. Start with the part that had nothing to do with weather, because the structural damage came first. The Egyptian provinces were divided into administrative districts, and each district had a governor. The Greeks called the districts nomes, so we call the governors nomarchs. In the early Old Kingdom, the job was exactly what it sounds like, an appointment. The king sent you out, you administered the province in his name, you collected what was owed, and when you died, you were buried at Memphis near the king, because Memphis was where power lived, and proximity to the king was the entire point of your existence. Then, gradually, across the 5th and 6th dynasties, 3 things changed. The office started passing from father to son, not by law, but by practice, the way these things always drift, until a district had a family attached to it, and the family had an army of local loyalties that the palace could not simply overrule. The tombs moved. Nomarchs stopped being buried at the capital and started building large decorated rock tombs in their own provinces, at places like Meir and Deir el-Gibrawi and Kubet el-Hawa. That is not a matter of taste. A man who spends his fortune on a monument in his home district rather than at the king's feet is telling you where he thinks his power comes from, and he is telling you in stone, in public, permanently, and the crown gave away its own tax base. Kings granted endowments to temples and mortuary cults, exempting the attached land and the people working it from state obligations in perpetuity. Every grant was an act of piety. Every grant was also a permanent subtraction from the revenue of every future king, and there was no mechanism for taking any of it back. Do that for 200 years, and you have hollowed out the fiscal core of the state, while simultaneously building up a class of regional dynasts with their own wealth, their own followings, and their own reasons to look after themselves first. On top of all that sat Pepi II, and his reign is the most famous statistic in Egyptian history. Manetho, the Egyptian priest who compiled a history for the Greek rulers of Egypt, more than 2,000 years after the fact, credits Pepi II with 94 years on the throne. The Turin King List, itself written 1,000 years after Pepi II died, gives him something over 90. Those two figures are why he gets described as the longest reigning monarch in recorded history. Modern Egyptologists are not comfortable with it. The highest date actually attested from Pepi II's own time is the year after the 31st cattle count, which on a biennial counting system works out to around year 62. After that, the contemporary record simply stops. Some specialists have argued that Manetho misread a damaged source and that the real figure is closer to 64 years, which is still extraordinary. Every scholar in this argument agrees the reign was unusually long, and the disagreement is only about whether it was very long or absurdly long. Either way, consider the administrative effect. A king comes to the throne as a young child, which means a regency and a long period where real power sits with courtiers. He then reigns for 6 decades or more, which means he outlives his own heirs, outlives the officials he trained, and spends his final years as an extremely old man presiding over a court that has had a lifetime to work out how to operate around him. When he finally dies, his successor rules for about a year. Then the throne starts changing hands rapidly. Manetho has a line about this period that is too good to leave out and too unreliable to state flatly. He describes a dynasty of 70 kings in 70 days. Nobody takes that as a literal headcount. It is a compiler's way of saying that the records had turned into an unusable blur, which is itself informative. Whatever happened at the end of the 6th dynasty happened fast enough that it was not properly recorded even by the Egyptians. So the building was already rotten. Then the roof came off. Around 2200 BC, something went wrong with the global climate. Paleoclimatologists call it the 4.2 kiloyear event, and it shows up in an unusually wide range of independent records, in lake sediments, in cave formations, in ice cores, in ancient coral. It is a phase of abrupt aridification and cooling across a band of the world that runs from the western Mediterranean through the Levant and Mesopotamia and on into South Asia. It is not a fringe hypothesis. The International Commission on Stratigraphy, the body that formally divides up geological time, uses this event to mark the boundary of the most recent subdivision of the Holocene. It is a line in the official calendar of the Earth. For Egypt, the mechanism is straightforward and terrible. Weaker monsoons over the Ethiopian highlands mean less water in the Blue Nile, which means lower floods in Egypt. The Egyptologist Fakhri Hassan has argued for a sudden and catastrophic reduction in the Nile floods, lasting 2 or 3 decades, severe enough to bring famine, and paralyze the political institutions of the country. There is a bleak line attributed to him about the Nile destroying the civilization it had nourished. And here is where a careful version of this story has to put the brakes on, because there are 2 complications that get skipped in the popular telling. The first is a straightforward archaeological problem. Flood level observations recorded at Elephantine, at the southern border, have at times appeared to indicate that flood levels during the first intermediate period were not below average at all, and possibly slightly above it. That is directly awkward for a story about a drought-driven collapse. Work since around 2000 has tended to support the reality of a severe early crisis, but the point stands that the evidence is not a single clean line pointing one way. The second is a matter of intellectual discipline. The archaeologist Karl Butzer made the argument, repeatedly, that rapid societal collapses almost never have a single cause. They have a stack of causes, and a climate shock landing on a healthy society is survivable, while the same shock landing on a society that has already given away its tax base and lost control of its provinces is not. That is the version this story is going to run with, and it is not a hedge. It is the more interesting reading. Egypt did not die of drought. Egypt had spent 2 centuries quietly disassembling the fiscal and political machinery that would have let it absorb a drought. And then the drought arrived and found nothing left to absorb it. The central government came apart. There is still a king, or rather there are kings, ruling from a city called Heracleopolis in the north. But their authority over the country is thin and getting thinner. In the south, a line of rulers based at Thebes, which up to this point had been an unimportant provincial town, starts behaving like an independent power. The country splits, and eventually the 2 halves fight. And in the middle of all that, a provincial governor at a place called Moala, on the east bank a short distance south of Thebes, cut his own biography into the pillars of his rock tomb. His name was Ankhtifi, and his inscription is one of the most quoted documents in Egyptian history. He holds both kinds of authority at once, secular governor and overseer of priests, which is exactly the combination you would expect from a local strongman in a period when the center has stopped functioning. He describes military campaigns, he describes taking control of neighboring territory, and he describes famine in language that has been reproduced in more or less every popular account of this period, saying that all of Upper Egypt was dying of hunger, that people were reduced to eating their own children, and that the whole country was moving up and down the river like locusts in search of food. Then he says that in his district, nobody starved because of him. That last part is the tell, because this is not a report. It is a tomb autobiography, a genre with rules, and the rules require the occupant to demonstrate that he lived a life worthy of a good afterlife. The same inscription has Ankhtifi announcing that nobody like him has existed before or will exist again, that he surpassed the deeds of all his ancestors, and that no one will equal him for 1,000,000 years. That is the register we are reading in. It is not modest, and it is not journalism. Egyptologists have argued about how much of it to believe for a long time. Catherine Bard has described the famine claims as standard rhetoric for tomb biographies, while noting they may still reflect genuine hardship. Stefan Seidelmeyer has made the sharper point, which is that the prominence of famine and disorder in the texts of this period may say less about how often people starved and more about what a local ruler needed to claim in order to justify holding power that was not legally his. If the king can no longer feed the country, then the man who can feed his province has a claim on obedience. Describing a catastrophe you personally averted is not a side detail in that argument. It is the argument. There is also a detail in the Moala inscription that is worth sitting with, because it punctures the saintly reading completely. The grain Ankhtifi sent to his starving neighbors was not a gift. It was sold. They paid for it in oil. So what do we actually have? Probably a real crisis, at least early in the period, and certainly a real fear of crisis that was endemic and widely expressed. But we are reading about it exclusively through men who had a strong professional interest in describing a disaster they were personally solving, and we should read it the way we would read any press release. Which brings us to the thing that actually broke, and it was not the food supply. Go back to the arrangement described at the beginning of this story. The king is a god. His ritual performance maintains Maat, the correct order of the universe. The flood is the visible, annual, unmissable proof that the arrangement is working. That is not an abstraction to an Egyptian farmer. It is the water arriving in the field. Now the water does not arrive, or it arrives thin, several years running, or the granaries do not open, because the state that filled them has stopped functioning. The theology has no comfortable answer for that. If the king is divine and the order fails, then either the king is not what he claims, or the divine order is not as reliable as advertised. Egyptian religion never wrote out a formal crisis of faith, because that is not the kind of thing Egyptian religion wrote out. But you can see the shock in what came afterward. And what came afterward is genuinely different in tone from anything before it. Before we get to that, a correction that most versions of this story never make. The first intermediate period gets called a dark age, and for the institution of kingship it certainly was. But the phrase implies that everyone was worse off, and the archaeology does not really support that. What the cemeteries show is a broadening. In the Old Kingdom, elaborate burial with grave goods was concentrated in a very narrow slice at the top. During the first intermediate period, the number of people getting a decent burial with decorated coffins and inscribed objects goes up, spread across the provinces. Regional workshops develop their own styles, sometimes rough by Memphite standards, sometimes strikingly original. Local rulers build substantial tombs and run their districts as functioning units. Ankhtifi's own tomb complex, with its columns and its offering areas, is not the product of anarchy. It is the product of structured local power. So the resources did not vanish. They redistributed. When the center stops taking everything and spending it on royal monuments, quite a lot of wealth stays where it was produced. A collapse at the top can look like an improvement at the middle, and for a provincial official in Middle Egypt in 2100 BC, this may have been the best time to be alive in 300 years. Hold both halves of that at once. The state failed, people starved, and simultaneously, more Egyptians than ever before were being buried, with their names on something, which is the context for the change in the funerary texts, and this is where we have to slow down and be careful, because the standard version of what follows is told with far more confidence than the evidence supports. Here is the standard version. In the Old Kingdom, the pyramid texts were carved in royal tombs and nowhere else. The elaborate spells for navigating the afterlife were a royal monopoly. Then the Old Kingdom fell. The king was exposed as fallible, and ordinary Egyptians took the afterlife for themselves. In the Middle Kingdom, we find a related but distinct body of spells. The coffin texts, painted on the coffins of officials and provincial worthies all over Egypt. Eternity had been privatized. The usual name for this is the democratization of the afterlife, and it makes a beautiful story, because a political collapse produces a spiritual revolution, and the little man wins. The problem is that a lot of specialists no longer think it happened. Mark Smith, who has worked on this in detail, concluded that no such change actually took place. Harold Hayes wrote a paper with the title, "The Death of the Democratization of the Afterlife," and observed that so much had been written against the theory that it might reasonably be considered obsolete. Their core objection is a point about evidence. The claim rests on the absence of pyramid texts from non-royal Old Kingdom tombs. But absence of evidence in a tomb is not evidence that the ideas were unavailable to the person in it. There are non-royal religious texts from the Old Kingdom. The identification of non-royal dead with Osiris turns up earlier than the theory allows, back in the reign of Pepi II. And ritual knowledge in Egypt was carried by priests and performances, not only by inscriptions, so what a tomb has written on its walls tells you about display budgets as much as about belief. The distinction the specialists use is between access and display, and it is a genuinely useful tool. Did more people gain access to the afterlife, or did more people gain the resources to advertise the access they already assumed they had? The argument is not finished. There are Egyptologists actively arguing the other way, pointing to real shifts in what non-royal tombs depict, and making the case that the change is substantive enough to keep the label. This is a live disagreement in a working field, not a settled correction. So here is the honest version, which is the one this story will use. What is not in dispute is that from the Middle Kingdom onward, elaborate afterlife texts are found on the coffins of people who were not kings, in large numbers, across the country. What is in dispute is whether that represents a new theology or a new distribution of wealth. We can see what changed on the outside of the coffins. What changed inside people's heads is not directly visible. and anyone who tells you otherwise is filling in the gap with a story. What we can say is that the writing of this period sounds different. There is a text usually called the Dialogue of a Man with His Ba, in which a man argues with his own soul about whether to go on living. It is bleak, and it is strange, and there is nothing remotely like it in the surviving material from the Pyramid Age. There is another, the Admonitions of Ipuwer, describing a world turned upside down, with the poor wearing fine linen, and the servants of the rich giving orders, and the land spinning like a potter's wheel. Ipuwer needs a warning label, because it is one of the most abused documents in ancient history. The only copy is a New Kingdom manuscript. The composition is usually dated to the Middle Kingdom or later, and whether it describes any actual historical collapse, or is a literary exercise in the genre of national lament, is disputed. It has been enthusiastically misused by people trying to line it up with other stories from other traditions. It is evidence of an Egyptian literary mood. It is not a news report from 2150 BC, but the mood is the point. For the first time in the surviving record, Egyptian writers are producing texts about doubt, about disorder, about a world where the arrangement does not hold, and a thoughtful person has to ask what that means. A civilization built on the assumption that the pattern always returns had just watched the pattern fail, and it wrote something down about it. The pattern did return, eventually. Around 2055 BC, a Theban king finished the job his family had started, defeated the northern rulers, and put the country back together under one crown. His name was Mentuhotep, and the Egypt he rebuilt was not the same country that had fallen apart. Mentuhotep II came out of a family of Theban warlords who had spent generations building up the south, and when he finished the war, he did something that tells you exactly how he wanted to be understood. He built his mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari, in a natural bay of cliffs on the west bank at Thebes, and he built it in terraces, rising in stages against the rock face. It is not a pyramid. It is not at Memphis. It is a new kind of monument in a new place, announcing that the center of gravity in Egypt had moved 500 miles south. And it dragged a god along with it. Amun was a local Theban deity, one of hundreds of local deities, with no particular claim on national attention. What happened to Amun over the following centuries is one of the clearest demonstrations in history that theology follows power rather than the other way around. Thebes produced the kings who reunified Egypt, so Thebes mattered, so the god of Thebes mattered, and Amun began to climb. He got merged with the sun god to become Amun-Re, which is how you promote a provincial god without offending an established one. His temple at Karnak began the long process of expansion that would eventually make it the largest religious complex ever built, and the wealth started flowing in, endowment by endowment, until the god of a minor southern town owned a substantial fraction of the country. That accumulation is a fuse, and it burns for 800 years before it reaches anything. The 11th dynasty did not last long after Mentuhotep. His line ends murkily, and the man who takes the throne around 1985 BC is a former vizier named Amenemhat, who almost certainly was not entitled to it. Amenemhat's response to that problem is instructive, because it is the response of a competent usurper everywhere. He moved the capital, founding a new resident city near the entrance to the Fayum, at a place whose name means Caesar of the Two Lands, which is not subtle. He installed his son as co-regent while he was still alive, inventing or at least formalizing a mechanism that would let the 12th dynasty hand power over cleanly for 200 years. And he commissioned literature. That last one deserves attention. The Middle Kingdom is when Egyptian writing stops being purely functional or purely religious and becomes literature in a sense we would recognize, with narrative, character, interiority, and craft. Some of it is clearly state-sponsored, designed to explain why the current arrangement is correct, and one of the most striking texts of the period is presented as the words of Amenemhat himself, speaking to his son, from beyond death. He describes being murdered, at night, in his own bedchamber, by men from his own household, while the guard was not watching. He tells his son that no one can be trusted, that the men you feed will turn on you, that friendship is a delusion of the powerful. Whether the assassination actually happened is not certain, though a passage in the story of Sinuhe seems to describe the same event from outside, and most scholars accept that something violent ended Amenemhat's reign. What is certain is that the text existed and was copied by schoolboys for centuries. The Egyptian state was circulating as a set text, a document in which a murdered king warns his heir that everyone around him is a potential killer. That is a very long way from the serene confidence of the Pyramid Age. Which brings us to the best piece of writing to survive from ancient Egypt. The story of Sinuhe opens with a court official on campaign in Libya when word arrives that the king has died. Sinuhe overhears something he was not meant to hear, panics, and runs. He crosses the eastern border, nearly dies of thirst in the desert, is rescued by nomads, and ends up in the Levant, where he does extremely well. He marries the daughter of a local ruler, acquires herds and land, raises sons, defeats a champion in single combat, and becomes wealthy and respected. And he is miserable, because he is going to die abroad. He is going to be buried in a sheepskin, in foreign ground, without the rites, without the tomb, without the offerings, without any of the apparatus that an Egyptian understood to be the difference between continuing and simply stopping. His success in exile is worth nothing against that. Eventually, the new king sends for him, and the letter of recall is included in the text, and it is astonishingly gentle. Come home. Think about the day you are buried. And Sinuhe returns, is received at court, is given a stone tomb and a garden, and is issued the equipment of a proper Egyptian death. The reason Sinuhe was copied for 800 years is that it is not really an adventure story. It is a story about homesickness so severe that a man will walk away from everything he has built, and about what home actually consists of, which for an Egyptian was not a place, but a set of arrangements for what happens after you stop breathing. It is also, incidentally, the most vivid surviving description of how Egyptians saw the world beyond their borders. Sinuhe's Levant is prosperous, well-governed, full of good food and fighting men, and completely impossible to die in. The 12th dynasty's most consequential king was Senwosret III, and he solved the problem that had destroyed the Old Kingdom. The provincial governors, the nomarchs, had been the mechanism by which central authority leaked away. Under Senwosret III, the great provincial tombs stopped being built. The nomarch class as an independent power essentially disappears from the record, replaced by an administration organized into departments reporting to the vizier, staffed by officials who serve at the pleasure of the crown and are buried near the residence rather than in their own districts. Exactly how this happened is not documented. There is no surviving decree abolishing the nomarchs, and Egyptologists disagree about whether this was a deliberate purge, a slow bureaucratic squeeze, or partly a change in burial fashion that makes the shift look sharper than it was. But the outcome is clear enough. The Middle Kingdom state got its provinces back. He also pushed south, hard. Egypt had always had an uneasy relationship with Nubia, the land above the First Cataract, which was the route to gold, ebony, ivory, incense, and manpower, and which contained states of its own that were perfectly capable of pushing back. Senwosret III built a chain of enormous mud brick fortresses through the Second Cataract region at Buhen, Semna, Kumma, Uronarti, and elsewhere, with walls 30 feet thick, ditches, bastions, arrow slits, and internal barracks and granaries. These are serious military architecture, built to hold territory and control traffic, and they are almost the first thing in Egyptian history that looks like the work of a state that expects to fight. His boundary inscription at Semna is aggressive in a way that Old Kingdom royal texts never are, drawing a line on the map and daring anyone to cross it. And then there are his statues. Egyptian royal portraiture, up to this point, is a study in serenity. Old Kingdom kings have smooth, calm, ageless faces. They are not portraits in our sense at all. They are images of the office, and the office does not get tired. The face of Senwosret III is completely different. Heavy lids, drooping at the outer corners. Deep lines cut from the nose to the mouth. Hollows under the cheekbones. Large protruding ears. A mouth set in something between grimness and exhaustion. He looks like a man who has not slept properly in a decade and is still going to work. Nobody knows for certain what this means, and there are competing readings. Some see genuine individual portraiture. Others argue it is a new ideological image, presenting the king as the burdened shepherd of his people, awake and watchful while the country sleeps, careworn rather than serene. Some see an assertion of experience and authority in a dynasty that started as usurpers. Whatever the intent, the effect is unmistakable. After the collapse, Egyptian kingship could no longer be sold purely as effortless divine calm. Somebody had to look like they were carrying it. The stone changed because the argument had changed. The Middle Kingdom is the period later Egyptians treated as classical. The form of the language used in its literature, which we call Middle Egyptian, became the prestige written language for the rest of Egyptian history, still being used for formal inscriptions 2,000 years later, long after nobody spoke anything like it. It occupies roughly the position that Latin held in Europe. When a scribe in the Ptolemaic period carved a temple wall, he was writing in a deliberately archaic register that a 12th dynasty official would have recognized, and a contemporary Egyptian in the street would have struggled with. It is also the period that produced the practical documents that show how good these people actually were at technical work. The Rhind mathematical papyrus, copied around 1550 BC from a Middle Kingdom original, is a working problem book. Its contents are relentlessly applied. How to divide loaves among men. How to calculate the slope of a pyramid face. How to work out the volume of a cylindrical granary. How to handle fractions in a system that expressed almost everything as sums of unit fractions, which is far harder than it sounds, and which the Egyptians managed with reference tables and a great deal of practice. There is a problem for the area of a circle that amounts, in effect, to a workable approximation of pi. The Edwin Smith surgical papyrus, also a New Kingdom copy of a much older text, is stranger and more impressive. It runs through 48 cases of physical trauma, starting at the head and working down, and each case follows the same structure. Title: Examination, describing what to look for and what to feel. Diagnosis, verdict, treatment. The verdicts are the remarkable part, because there are 3 of them. An ailment I will treat, an ailment I will contend with, and an ailment not to be treated. That third category is a doctor writing down, in a culture saturated with magic, that some injuries cannot be fixed, and that the honest thing is to say so. The text describes the brain, the meninges, and the effects of head injury on the opposite side of the body. Its reasoning is observational and its language is clinical, and it stands in sharp contrast to other Egyptian medical papyri that are largely collections of spells. The Egyptians clearly held both approaches at once, and the Edwin Smith papyrus shows what they could do when they leaned on observation. They were also reshaping the landscape. The Fayum, a large depression west of the Nile fed by a side channel, was the target of major hydraulic works under the 12th dynasty, regulating the inflow and reclaiming substantial areas of extremely fertile land. This is the state doing at scale exactly what it had always done in principle, which is intervening in the relationship between water and dirt in order to produce more grain. For roughly 200 years, this works beautifully. And then the 12th dynasty ends, and the 13th begins, and something goes soft. The 13th dynasty is a long list of kings with short reigns, dozens of them. The state does not obviously collapse. The administration keeps functioning. The vizier's office continues, but the throne turns over constantly, and royal authority thins out. In the eastern delta, a population of people from the Levant, who had been settling in Egypt for generations as traders, craftsmen, sailors, and soldiers, was becoming numerous and organized enough to run its own affairs. And they had something Egypt did not. The people we call the Hyksos take their name from an Egyptian phrase meaning rulers of foreign lands, which was a title, not an ethnic label. They were not a horde that came over the horizon. The archaeology at their capital, Avaris in the eastern delta, excavated over decades by Manfred Bietak and his team, shows a Levantine population living in Egypt for a long time before any of them ruled anything, with their own house forms, their own burial customs including the interment of donkeys, their own pottery, and their own gods, alongside Egyptian material and clearly integrated into the local economy. What happened around 1650 BC looks less like an invasion and more like a takeover. As central authority weakened, the most organized power in the delta stopped taking orders and started giving them. Hyksos rulers took Egyptian royal titles, wrote their names in cartouches, and ran the north as pharaohs, while the 13th dynasty's successors held Thebes and the south, and a Nubian kingdom centered on Kerma, which was a genuine power with monumental architecture of its own, held the far south and traded happily with the Hyksos over Thebes's head. Egypt was squeezed between two foreign powers that were in contact with each other. There is a surviving account of a Theban king intercepting a Hyksos message to the ruler of Kush, proposing coordinated action against Thebes. Whatever else the second intermediate period was, it was the moment Egypt discovered it could be surrounded. Later Egyptian tradition remembered the Hyksos period as a catastrophe of burning and sacrilege. Contemporary evidence is much less dramatic. The Hyksos worshipped Egyptian gods, particularly Seth, employed Egyptian scribes, and maintained Egyptian administrative forms. They also, and this is the part that mattered, brought a technology package with them: the chariot, a light, spoke-wheeled, two-horse vehicle with a driver and an archer, which was the most sophisticated machine of the age and which Egypt did not have. The composite bow, built from layered wood, horn and sinew, far more powerful than a simple self-bow, and small enough to shoot from a moving platform. The khopesh, a curved bronze sickle sword, better bronze working generally, improved body armor and helmets, the upright loom, new musical instruments, new crops and livestock breeds. Egypt had been, for 1,000 years, a place that did not have to think very hard about war. The desert did the work. The cataracts did the work. Now a foreign dynasty was sitting in the delta, and Egyptian troops were finding out what a chariot squadron does to infantry in open ground. The War of Expulsion took at least 2 generations. A Theban king named Seqenenre-Tau appears to have died in it, and his mummy is one of the most disturbing objects in the Cairo Museum, with multiple severe head wounds, including injuries consistent with an axe and a spear, and no defensive wounds on the arms. He was killed violently, at close range, probably having been restrained or already down. His son Kamose pushed north and left an account of the campaign, carved on stelae, complaining bitterly about the humiliation of sharing his country with an Asiatic and a Nubian. And Kamose's successor, Ahmose I, finally took Avaris around 1550 BC and pursued the survivors into the Levant. That last detail is the whole point. Egypt did not stop at its own border. It kept going, and it kept going for the next 400 years, and the reason is written all over the century that preceded it. A country that had spent its entire existence believing the desert would protect it had just been occupied by people who walked in through the delta. The lesson the Egyptian state took from that was not build a better wall. It was make sure the fighting happens somewhere else. So Egypt built a professional standing army with a permanent officer corps, chariot divisions, and organized regiments named after gods. It adopted every piece of Hyksos military technology and improved on it, and it adopted a doctrine of forward defense, projecting force into the Levant to keep any potential rival weak, divided, and far away. A civilization that had been essentially inward-looking for 15 centuries turned into an empire in about 50 years, and it did it out of fear. The dynasty that came out of that war, the 18th, produced the most famous names in Egyptian history and presided over the richest period the country ever had. Ahmose I reunified Egypt and pushed into both the Levant and Nubia. His successors kept going. Thutmose I campaigned all the way to the Euphrates, which for an Egyptian was a genuinely disorienting experience, because he found a great river that ran the wrong way. Egyptian scribes had to describe it as the inverted water that flows downstream while going upstream. When your entire mental model of a river comes from one river, another one is a philosophical problem. Then, around 1473 BC, the throne passed to a child, and his stepmother became regent, and within a few years she was not a regent anymore. Hatshepsut was the daughter of Thutmose I and the widow of Thutmose II. Her stepson, Thutmose III, was an infant when his father died. She governed in his name, and then at some point she took the full royal titulary, was crowned as king, and had herself depicted in the complete regalia of Pharaoh, including the ceremonial beard, because the iconography of the office had no female version and she was claiming the office rather than adapting it. She ruled for roughly 2 decades, and by any measure, it went well. The building program was enormous, including work at Karnak and her own mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahri, built against the same cliff bay Mentuhotep had chosen 8 centuries earlier, in ascending colonnaded terraces. It is one of the most striking buildings from the ancient world, and it looks startlingly modern, which is an accident of taste, but a real one. The walls of that temple carry the record of the expedition she is best known for, a trading voyage to a place called Punt, somewhere along the Red Sea coast or the Horn of Africa. The reliefs show the ships, the loading, the houses of Punt on stilts, the local ruler and his wife, and cargo, including live incense trees with their roots balled for transplanting. They planted them in front of the temple. There are still pits where they stood. Thutmose III grew up and eventually ruled alone for more than 3 decades and turned out to be the most effective military commander Egypt ever produced. His first campaign, in 1457 BC, ended at Megiddo in northern Palestine, where a coalition of Levantine rulers had assembled to challenge Egyptian control. The Megiddo account, carved in the annals at Karnak, is unusually detailed and includes something rare in royal inscriptions, which is a council of war in which the king's own officers disagree with him. 3 routes lead to the city. 2 are safe. One goes through a narrow pass where the army would have to march in single file and could be destroyed piecemeal. His commanders argue for the safe roads. He takes the pass, on the reasoning that the enemy will not expect it, and emerges onto the plain unopposed. Then he wins the battle and immediately loses control of his army, because the Egyptian troops stop to loot the abandoned enemy camp instead of pursuing, allowing the defeated coalition to be hauled up the walls of Megiddo on knotted sheets. The result is a 7-month siege that could have been a single afternoon. The reason that detail is in the official account is genuinely interesting, and the most likely explanation is that it functions as a lesson rather than an embarrassment, a warning about discipline preserved because the king wanted it preserved. Whatever the motive, it gives us something almost unique, which is an Egyptian royal inscription admitting that things did not go perfectly. Thutmose III campaigned 17 times. By the end, Egyptian authority ran from deep in Nubia to the Euphrates, and Egypt was the wealthiest state in the world, largely because it controlled the Nubian gold mines. That wealth is visible in the diplomatic correspondence of the following century, a cache of clay tablets found at Amarna, written in Akkadian, the diplomatic language of the age. They include letters from the kings of Babylon, Assyria, Mitanni, and the Hittites, addressing the Egyptian king as brother, negotiating marriages, and asking for gold. Repeatedly, and with increasing irritation, asking for gold. One king complains that the gold he received was underweight when melted down. Another notes that in Egypt, gold is as plentiful as dust. Egypt had become the Bank of the Near East, and everybody knew it. Under Amenhotep III, in the first half of the 14th century, the empire reached a condition it never reached again. He barely campaigned because he did not need to. He built on a scale that had not been seen since the Pyramid Age, including a mortuary temple whose two-seated colossi still stand in the field, known to Greek visitors as the Colossi of Memnon. He issued commemorative scarabs like press releases announcing his marriages, the construction of a pleasure lake for his queen, and the number of lions he had personally shot. His reign is the high watermark, and it is worth noticing that a country's peak is often the last moment before someone decides it needs fixing. Somewhere in this period, the kings stopped building pyramids, and the reason is a straightforward engineering failure of a different kind. A pyramid is a sign. It announces, permanently and from a great distance, that something extremely valuable is buried underneath it. Every royal pyramid in Egypt was robbed, most of them in antiquity, some of them almost immediately. 1,500 years of experiment had produced an unambiguous result, which is that you cannot build a burglar-proof monument, because the monument is an advertisement. So the New Kingdom kings inverted the design. They separated the tomb from the temple entirely. The mortuary temple, where the cult was performed, went out in the open on the West Bank floodplain, where everyone could see it. The tomb went into a remote dry valley behind the cliffs, cut deep into the rock, its entrance concealed under rubble, guarded and unmarked. We call it the Valley of the Kings. It was, on its own terms, a total failure. Every tomb in it was robbed except one, and the exception survived by accident, because the debris from a later tomb happened to bury its entrance. But it worked well enough to change the shape of Egyptian architecture, and it created something the pyramids never did, which is a permanent workforce of specialist craftsmen who had to be housed, fed, and kept quiet for 400 years, which is how we get the single best window into ordinary ancient life anywhere in the ancient world. The village is called Deir el-Medina, in a small enclosed valley on the west bank at Thebes, walled, isolated, and purpose-built. The men who lived there cut and decorated the royal tombs. They were literate at rates far above the Egyptian norm, because their work required it, and they threw their garbage into pits. Papyrus was expensive. Limestone flakes were free, and the desert around the village produced them by the ton. So the people of Deir el-Medina wrote on flakes and potsherds, and we call these ostraca, and thousands upon thousands of them have been recovered. They contain the following: work rosters, tool inventories, wage disputes, letters between neighbors, lawsuits, a record of a woman conducting property transactions in her own name, complaints about a colleague, sketches, some competent, some crude, some clearly done for fun, practice writing, a drawing of a cat serving a mouse, and absence registers. A foreman kept track of who did not turn up for work and why, and the reasons survive, and they are the most human documents to come out of ancient Egypt. Men missed work because they were brewing beer, because they were building their own house, because a scorpion had stung them, because they were embalming a relative, because their mother was ill, because their wife or daughter was menstruating, because they had been drinking with a colleague, which is recorded without apparent judgment. Nobody wrote any of that to be read in 3,000 years. That is the entire reason it is valuable. Everything else from ancient Egypt is a monument, addressed to gods or posterity or both. This is a man with a list, keeping track of his crew, and his crew sound exactly like people you have worked with. Deir el-Medina also gives us the clearest picture of the legal position of Egyptian women, which was, by the standards of the ancient world, an Egyptian woman could own property in her own right and dispose of it. She could enter contracts. She could initiate divorce, and property arrangements on divorce were subject to agreements that could be quite protective. She could sue, be sued, testify, and serve on juries in local courts. She inherited and bequeathed. There is documentation of women lending grain at interest and buying and selling land. None of that makes ancient Egypt an equal society. Formal office was overwhelmingly male. Most scribes were men, and the assumptions built into the literature are patriarchal throughout. But when Greek visitors arrived centuries later, they were visibly startled, and Herodotus wrote about Egypt as a place where the customs of men and women were reversed, compared with what he considered normal. He was exaggerating for effect. He was exaggerating something real, and in the New Kingdom, that broadening reaches the afterlife. What we call the Book of the Dead is not a book, but a flexible collection of spells, produced commercially, written on papyrus, and buried with the deceased, available in versions ranging from lavish custom manuscripts to cheap copies with a blank space where the buyer's name got filled in later. You could purchase eternity off the shelf. Its most famous scene is the weighing of the heart. The dead person is led into a hole. Their heart, which the Egyptians understood as the seat of thought and character, is placed on one pan of a balance. On the other pan sits a single ostrich feather. That feather is ma'at, the same concept from the very beginning of this story, the correct order of things, now functioning as a unit of measurement. Thoth records the result. Anubis adjusts the balance. Osiris presides. And beside the scales waits a composite creature with the head of a crocodile, the forequarters of a lion, and the hindquarters of a hippopotamus, whose name translates as the devourer, and who eats the hearts that fail. To be eaten is not to be punished, it is to stop existing, which for an Egyptian was the only genuine catastrophe. There is a spell in the collection, addressed to the deceased's own heart, asking it not to testify against them. 1,200 years earlier, the equipment for surviving death was carved on the walls of a king's burial chamber, and nowhere else. Now, it was a product with a price list. Whatever the correct scholarly account of how that happened, the endpoint is not in doubt, which is roughly the state of the world when the son of Amenhotep III came to the throne around 1352 BC and decided that all of it was wrong. He began conventionally as Amenhotep IV. Within a few years he had changed his name, changed his god, changed his capital, changed the art, and changed the terms on which Egyptians were permitted to approach the divine. The god was the Aten, the visible disk of the sun, not a new deity. The Aten had existed as a minor solar concept for generations, and his own father had promoted it somewhat. What was new was exclusivity. Temples to other gods were closed, their revenues diverted, their priesthoods disbanded. Agents were sent around the country to chisel out the name of Amun from monuments, and in some places, the plural word for gods was attacked as well, which is a startling thing to find on a temple wall. He renamed himself Akhenaten, meaning something like effective for the Aten. He also abandoned Thebes, on a virgin site in Middle Egypt, on the East Bank, with no prior religious associations at all. He founded a new capital called Akhetaten, the horizon of the Aten. We call it Amarna. He marked its limits with boundary stelae cut into the cliffs, on which he swore that he would not extend the city beyond them, and the city went up fast, with palaces, temples open to the sky rather than roofed and dark, workshops, and housing for tens of thousands of people. The theology was genuinely unusual. The Aten had no myth, no consort, no birth story, no death and rebirth, no animal form, and eventually almost no human form. It was depicted as a disk, with rays ending in small hands, some of which hold the sign for life, extended toward the royal family. That last part is critical. The rays reached the king. Ordinary people did not approach the Aten directly. They approached Akhenaten, who approached the Aten. The religion routed all access through one man. Whether to call this monotheism is a real argument, and not a pedantic one. The Aten was elevated above and eventually to the exclusion of other gods in official worship, which is a genuine and radical break. But other divine beings do not vanish entirely from the record. The household religion of ordinary Egyptians appears to have carried on with its usual small gods, and the doctrine is inseparable from the divinity of the king in a way that makes the comparison with later monotheisms awkward. Some scholars prefer henotheism, the elevation of one god without denying others. The honest position is that Egypt produced something in this period that has no exact parallel, and that our vocabulary was not built to describe. The art is the part everybody notices, and here we can be precise, because the Egyptians left their working method on the walls. Amarna figures have long faces, long necks, narrow shoulders, heavy hips and thighs, protruding stomachs, and spindly lower legs. The royal family is shown in intimate domestic scenes with no earlier precedent, the king and queen seated with their daughters climbing on them, the king kissing a child, the family eating. Grief is depicted openly at a royal death, and underneath it is a modified grid. Enough grid traces survive from the period for the system to be reconstructed, and what the artists did was add 2 squares to the standard 18. One went in between the neck and shoulder line and the hairline to accommodate the longer neck and face. The other accommodated the pendulous stomach. But the knee line stayed where it had always been, on square 6, which in the old 18-square system was 1/3 of the way up the figure, and in the new 20-square system was less than that. That single retained convention is why Amarna figures have short lower legs. Sit with what that means. For the only time in 3,000 years, Egyptian artists rebuilt the proportional system, and they did it by editing the existing one, keeping most of it, changing 2 rows, and letting the arithmetic produce the strangeness. Even the revolution used the grid. There is an old and persistent theory that the Amarna style reflects a medical condition afflicting the king, and it should be treated skeptically. The style is applied to everyone at Amarna, including courtiers and the queen and the young princesses. A physical peculiarity of one man does not explain why his officials were drawn with the same hips. Far more likely, the royal body was being depicted according to a new set of religious ideas about the king's nature, and everyone else was rendered in the king's image. Nefertiti, his queen, appears throughout with unusual prominence, in scenes and poses normally reserved for kings, including at least one image of her in the pose of a pharaoh striking an enemy. Whether she eventually ruled in her own right, possibly under another name after Akhenaten's death, is one of the great open questions of Egyptology, and remains unresolved. While all of this was happening, the empire was being neglected, and we know because the letters survive. The Amarna tablets include desperate correspondence from Egyptian vassals in the Levant. Cities are being attacked. Neighbors are defecting. Rulers who describe themselves as the king's loyal servants write repeatedly asking for troops, sometimes for as few as 50 men, and report that no answer has come. One correspondent, from Byblos, writes again and again over years, his situation deteriorating in real time across the archive. It is not clear that Egypt lost the empire under Akhenaten, and some of these letters may reflect normal levels of vassal complaining. But the impression left by the archive is of a court preoccupied with something else. Akhenaten died around 1336 BC, after roughly 17 years. What followed was fast. There were 1 or 2 short reigns of uncertain identity. Then a boy of about 9 took the throne. He had been named Tutankhaten, in honor of the Aten. Within a few years he was Tutankhamun, in honor of Amun, and a stela was issued in his name describing the state of the country before the restoration in devastating terms, with the temples fallen into ruin, the shrines overgrown, the land in chaos, and the gods refusing to answer. The temples reopened, the endowments were restored, the priesthoods came back, Amarna was abandoned, and its buildings were taken apart, and the small standardized blocks they were built from, which we call talatat, were carted off and used as rubble fill inside later structures, particularly at Karnak. Tens of thousands of them have been recovered from inside the walls of buildings put up by the kings who came after. Tutankhamun died young, in his late teens, and was buried in a small tomb in the Valley of the Kings that was clearly not made for a king, hurriedly, with equipment that in some cases appears to have been made for somebody else. Debris from a later tomb covered the entrance, and it stayed covered until 1922. The most famous ancient Egyptian in the modern world is a minor king who died before he could accomplish anything, and he is famous for the single reason that everybody else got robbed. Then came Horemheb, a career general with no royal blood, who took the throne after the dynasty ran out of heirs and who finished the job. Akhenaten's monuments were dismantled. His name was chiseled out. When later Egyptians compiled their lists of legitimate kings, the years of Akhenaten, Tutankhamun, and their immediate successors were simply assigned to Horemheb, as though the intervening reigns had not occurred. Where Akhenaten had to be referred to at all, he could be called the enemy, or that criminal, and it worked, completely. For more than 3,000 years, nobody knew he had existed. He is absent from Manetho, absent from the classical historians, absent from every account of Egypt available to the world until the 19th century, when archaeologists working at Amarna found a city nobody had heard of, built for a king nobody had heard of, worshipping a god nobody had heard of. That is the payoff of this entire story, and it is worth stating plainly. The system did not merely survive the most radical challenge ever mounted against it. It survived, and then it went back and edited the record so that the challenge had never happened. Egyptian civilization did not just have institutional continuity. It had an immune response, and the immune response included memory. What comes after is a long, uneven, occasionally magnificent decline, and it starts with the most famous king in Egyptian history. Ramesses II took the throne around 1279 BC and held it for 67 years. He fathered a large number of children, outlived at least a dozen of his own heirs, and built more than any other Egyptian king, including the rock-cut temples at Abu Simbel, the great hypostyle hall at Karnak, begun by his father Seti, and a mortuary temple and a new delta capital. He also inscribed his name on a great many monuments he did not build, which was standard practice, and which he did more than anyone. He is best known for a battle he did not win. In 1274 BC, at Kadesh in Syria, Ramesses marched against the Hittite Empire and was ambushed. Deceived by captured scouts into believing the Hittite army was far away, he advanced with his forces strung out across miles of country, and a Hittite chariot force struck the 2nd Division while the 1st was making camp. The Egyptian army was very nearly destroyed. What saved it appears to have been a combination of the king rallying what was around him, the arrival of a separate Egyptian force from another direction at a critical moment, and the Hittite chariotry stopping to loot the camp. The battle ended with both armies bloodied, and neither in possession of the field in any decisive sense. Ramesses withdrew. Kadesh stayed Hittite. He then carved the story of his overwhelming personal victory onto temple walls across Egypt, in more copies and more detail than any other event in Egyptian history, in 2 distinct literary versions, with himself at the center, abandoned by his troops, and single-handedly turning the tide. We know the other side of it because the Hittite records survive. They describe the outcome quite differently, and 16 years later, the 2 empires signed a treaty. It survives in both an Egyptian version on a temple wall and a Hittite version on clay tablets from their capital, which makes it the earliest peace treaty for which we have the text from both parties. It provides for non-aggression, mutual defense, and the extradition of fugitives. It was followed by a diplomatic marriage. Put the two records side by side, and you have a lesson in reading history that is worth more than the battle. The temple wall says total victory. The tablets say negotiated stalemate. Both are official. Both are contemporary. Neither is lying exactly, and if only one had survived, we would believe it. The empire held together for another century, and then the entire eastern Mediterranean fell over. The late Bronze Age collapse, in the decades around 1200 BC, remains one of the genuinely unsolved problems in ancient history. Across a few decades, the Hittite Empire disappeared. The Mycenaean palace civilization of Greece was destroyed. Major cities in the Levant were burned. Trade networks that had operated for centuries stopped, and writing systems fell out of use in some regions entirely. The causes proposed include drought, earthquake swarms, systems collapse in over-specialized trade networks, internal revolt, migration, and new military methods. And the current consensus is essentially that it was several of those at once. Into that, Egypt faced what its records call the Sea Peoples, a coalition of groups arriving by land and water, apparently moving with families and possessions, which suggests migration rather than raiding. Ramesses III fought them off in the early 12th century, in a land battle and a naval engagement in the Delta mouths that he recorded in enormous relief at his mortuary temple at Medinet Habu. Egypt survived. Almost nothing else in its world did. And survival cost more than the country had. Which brings us to a single dated document that says more about the end of the new kingdom than any battle relief. In the 29th year of the reign of Ramesses III, around 1157 BC, the workmen of Deir el-Medina stopped working. They were state employees, paid in rations, principally grain, and the rations were late. They had been late before. Earlier that year, the scribe Amenacht had personally gone to a nearby temple and obtained 46 sacks of emmer wheat as a stopgap, which the men accepted even though it was less than they were owed. That is the detail that tells you the system was already failing, because a scribe should not be improvising the payroll out of a neighboring institution's granary. It did not hold. The crew walked out, past the checkpoints of the necropolis, and staged a sit-in at the mortuary temple of Thutmose III. The record, written by Amenacht himself and preserved on a papyrus now in Turin, has them shouting that they are hungry. Officials came and negotiated. Grain was found. Days later they walked out again, occupying another royal mortuary temple, and refused to go home, saying they wanted to put their case to the Pharaoh directly. They pointed out that they lacked not just grain, but oil, fish, and vegetables. This is the oldest labor strike for which we have a contemporary written record, and it happened in the mortuary temples of dead kings, which for an Egyptian was an outrageous place to sit down, because those buildings existed to sustain the cults of divine ancestors. The workers occupied the machinery of royal eternity in order to get paid. Go back to the beginning of this story and look at what has just happened. The Egyptian state began as a mechanism for collecting grain, storing it, and giving it out. That mechanism produced the surplus, the bureaucracy, the writing, the pyramids, the empire, everything. And 1300 years later, the granary failed to open, and the men who built the tombs of the pharaohs sat down in the temple of a god-king and shouted that they were hungry. The machine had stopped doing the one thing it was originally built to do. What followed was worse. The papyri from the end of the New Kingdom include the records of tomb robbery investigations, and they are extraordinary documents. Commissions were appointed. Suspects were arrested and interrogated, sometimes under torture. Confessions were recorded, naming accomplices and describing exactly how a gang had broken into a royal tomb, what they found, how they divided the gold, and who they had bribed. The people involved were not outsiders. They were necropolis workers, guards, minor officials, priests, The very apparatus built to protect the dead kings was systematically robbing them, and the investigations were themselves compromised by officials protecting their own interests. Eventually, the priesthood gave up on defending the tombs. In a series of operations, they went through the Valley of the Kings, collected the royal mummies, stripped what was left of value, rewrapped them, labeled them, and hid them in bulk. 2 of these caches were found in the 19th century, one in a shaft near Deir el-Bahri, and one inside a tomb in the valley itself. In them, stacked together, were Seqenenre Tao, Thutmose III, Seti I, Ramesses II, and many more. The greatest kings of the Egyptian Empire spent 3,000 years hidden in a hole because their own successors could not keep them safe. After 1069 BC, the country divided again, less violently than before. Kings ruled from Tanis in the delta, and the high priests of Amun ruled Thebes and the south in practice, with the 2 families intermarried and mostly cooperative. Then came dynasties of Libyan descent, whose ancestors had entered Egypt as prisoners and mercenaries, and who had risen through the army until they held the throne. They ruled as Egyptians, took Egyptian names, and eventually fragmented into competing local powers, until at one point there were several men in Egypt calling themselves kings simultaneously. And then Egypt was conquered by people who wanted to make it more Egyptian. The kingdom of Kush in Nubia, centered on Napata near the Fourth Cataract, had been under Egyptian control for centuries and had absorbed Egyptian religion thoroughly, particularly the cult of Amun. In the 8th century BC, as Egypt fell apart, the Kushite kings moved north, and by around 720 BC, they ruled the whole country as the 25th dynasty. What they did with it is the most interesting cultural episode in the last 1,000 years of this story. They did not impose Nubian culture on Egypt. They restored Egyptian culture aggressively, and specifically the culture of the distant past. Kushite kings sponsored a deliberate revival of Old and Middle Kingdom forms. Sculptors copied styles that were 2,000 years out of date. Scribes revived archaic language and old spellings. Religious texts that had fallen out of use were dug up and reinstated. Temples were repaired the length of the country, and they built pyramids. Not in Egypt, where nobody had built one in 800 years, but at home in Nubia, steep-sided and much smaller than the Egyptian originals, in numbers that eventually exceeded every pyramid in Egypt combined. There are more pyramids in Sudan today than in Egypt. Here is the detail that ties this to the opening of this story. The proportional grid, the system that had governed the drawing of the human figure since the 12th dynasty, was reformed in this period, and the specialist evidence points to the 25th dynasty as the time it happened. The squares were made smaller, at a ratio of 6 new squares to 5 old ones. Where the standing figure had occupied 18 squares from the soles to the hairline, it now occupied 21 squares from the soles to the upper eyelid. The hairline fell at 21.6 and stopped sitting on a grid line at all. One suggestion is that the new squares corresponded roughly to the palm, the standard Egyptian unit, since the forearm now occupied 6 squares, and the small cubit was 6 palms. So the single most conservative technical convention in Egyptian civilization, after roughly 1,700 years, was finally revised. And it was revised under a dynasty of foreign kings from Sudan, whose entire cultural program was the restoration of ancient Egyptian tradition. The outsiders who came to preserve the system were the ones who changed it. And even then, notice what they changed, not the body. The proportions of the figure barely moved. They renumbered the ruler. The Kushite period ended the way most things in this part of the story end, which is that a larger empire arrived. The Assyrians invaded, and in 663 BC, they sacked Thebes, the greatest religious center in Egypt, and carried off its wealth. The event was severe enough to be referenced as a byword for catastrophe in the literature of neighboring peoples. The Kushite kings withdrew south, where their kingdom continued for another 1,000 years. Egypt got one more good century. The Assyrians had installed local rulers to govern for them, and one of those rulers, Psamtik I, based at Sais in the western delta, quietly consolidated the country while Assyrian attention was elsewhere, and by around 656 BC was ruling an independent Egypt. His dynasty, the 26th, produced the last sustained flourishing of the native Egyptian state. The Saite period doubled down on the archaism the Kushites had started. Sculpture imitated Old Kingdom models so closely that dating individual pieces can be difficult. Ancient titles were revived. It was a culture consciously curating itself, which is what happens when a society has enough history that its own past becomes a resource. But it was also, in practice, an increasingly cosmopolitan and commercial state. Psamtik and his successors made heavy use of Greek and Carian mercenaries, whose graffiti can still be seen carved into the leg of a colossal statue at Abu Simbel, written by soldiers on an expedition up the Nile. A Greek trading settlement was established at Naucratis in the delta, licensed and controlled but real, giving Greeks a permanent commercial foothold. A canal linking the Nile to the Red Sea was undertaken. An expedition was reportedly dispatched to sail around Africa. The Egyptian language had also moved on. The everyday administrative script of this period is what we call demotic, a fast cursive derived from earlier hieratic, used for contracts, letters, accounts, and eventually literature. By this point, Egypt was operating 3 writing systems simultaneously: hieroglyphs for monuments, a deliberately ancient and increasingly ornamental script; hieratic for religious manuscripts; demotic for daily business. That is a civilization writing its own past and present in different alphabets. It is also, around 450 BC, the Egypt that Herodotus visited, or claimed to. His account is our most detailed outside description of the country in this period, and it is a mixture of accurate observation, second-hand information from priests and guides who told him what visitors wanted to hear, and material that is simply wrong. He is unreliable on the pyramids, on chronology, and on anything that happened more than a couple of centuries before his visit. He's often excellent on what he could see with his own eyes. And what struck him hardest was that Egypt seemed inverted, old, enormous, full of buildings nobody could explain, a place with a past so deep that the Greeks, who thought of themselves as an ancient people, were told by Egyptian priests that they were children. That conversation, whether or not it happened as reported, captures something true. By the time Greece was producing the culture we think of as classical, Egypt had been running for 2,500 years and was in its own opinion in decline. The independence did not last. In 525 BC, the Persian king Cambyses invaded and defeated the Egyptian army at Pelusium, and Egypt became a province of the Persian Empire, its rulers counted by later Egyptians as the 27th dynasty. Persian rule was, by the standards of empires, reasonably competent. Darius codified Egyptian law and finished the Red Sea Canal. He is depicted on Egyptian monuments as a pharaoh, performing pharaonic ritual, because that is how one ruled Egypt. Egypt revolted repeatedly, and in the early 4th century BC, actually succeeded, regaining independence for around 60 years under a series of native dynasties, the last significant native rulers Egypt would ever have. Nectanebo I and Nectanebo II built extensively, and the temples of this period are the direct ancestors of the great structures the Greeks would later complete. Then Persia came back, in 343 BC, and this time the occupation was harsher. It lasted 11 years. In 332 BC, Alexander of Macedon marched into Egypt and encountered essentially no resistance. The Persian satrap surrendered. Alexander went to Memphis, sacrificed to the Apis bull, and was acknowledged as pharaoh. He founded a city on the Mediterranean coast and named it after himself. Then he took a small party west into the desert to the oasis of Siwa to consult the oracle of Amun And whatever he was told there, he came back satisfied. He left within a year and never returned alive. His body came back, eventually, and was buried in Alexandria. His general Ptolemy took Egypt, and the Ptolemaic dynasty ruled for 300 years, until Cleopatra VII lost it to Rome. And here is what the Ptolemies did, which is the point this entire story has been traveling toward. They were Macedonian Greeks. They spoke Greek. Their capital, Alexandria, was a Greek city with a Greek intellectual culture. The library, the museum, Euclid and Eratosthenes, and the rest. For nearly 3 centuries, with one late exception, they did not bother to learn Egyptian, and they ruled as pharaohs. They were crowned at Memphis. They took the full pharaonic titulary. They performed the rituals. They had themselves depicted on temple walls in the traditional kilt and crown, in the traditional proportions, making the traditional offerings to the traditional gods. Above all, they built. The best preserved temples in Egypt today are Ptolemaic. Edfu, almost intact, is a Ptolemaic building. Dendera is Ptolemaic and Roman. Kom Ombo, Philae, Esna. Foreign kings who could not read the inscriptions they were commissioning spent 300 years constructing the most complete surviving examples of Egyptian sacred architecture, in a style already 2,000 years old when they started, which forces a reassessment of the whole story. Egypt was not conquered to death. Egypt was inherited. Run the list. The Hyksos took Egyptian titles and worshipped Egyptian gods. The Kushites conquered Egypt in order to restore Egyptian tradition and did it more rigorously than the Egyptians had. The Persians had themselves carved as pharaohs performing pharaonic ritual. Alexander went to Siwa. The Ptolemies built Edfu. Later the Roman emperors, who ruled Egypt as personal property and had no interest whatsoever in its theology, appear on Egyptian temple walls in Egyptian dress, offering to Egyptian gods, their names written in cartouches. Every single occupying power reached the same conclusion, independently, over the course of 1,300 years. The only legitimate way to rule this land was to put on its clothes. That is not the behavior of conquerors toward a defeated culture. That is what happens when the cultural system is more durable than any of the political systems that capture it. The machine kept running, and it simply absorbed whoever was standing at the controls, which returns us, finally, to a man with a pot of red paint. The grid survived all of it. It survived the collapse of the Old Kingdom and the famine that came with it. It survived the Hyksos. It was modified by Akhenaten and restored after him. It was renumbered under a dynasty of Nubian kings. It survived the Assyrians and the Persians and the Macedonians. Among the last securely dated examples of its use is a memorial stone for a woman named Tentimhotep from Saqqara, laid out on a ruled grid in the 10th year of the reign of Cleopatra VII. Cleopatra, the last pharaoh, the one at the far end of the story, closer in time to us than to the builders of the Great Pyramid. In her reign, in a workshop outside Memphis, a craftsman was still ruling squares on stone, using a system devised nearly 2,000 years earlier and revised once. And even that was not quite the end. The last securely dated hieroglyphic inscription was carved at Philae on an island near the First Cataract in the 4th century after Christ. More than 3,000 years after somebody scratched a quantity onto a bone label and tied it to a wine jar at Abydos, an Egyptian was still writing in that script. Then the temples closed. The priesthoods ended. The knowledge of how to read the signs was lost. And for 15 centuries, the inscriptions covering the monuments of Egypt were beautiful, ubiquitous, and completely silent. Which leaves the question this whole story started with. How does a civilization last that long? Not by being unchanging, because it was not. It changed constantly. It argued with itself, revised its theology, rebuilt its art, redesigned its tombs, reformed its bureaucracy, and produced at least one king who tried to burn the whole thing down. It lasted because of what it did with change. Every revision was made to fit the existing framework, and the framework itself was treated as the thing being conserved. The Egyptians did not resist innovation. They domesticated it. New ideas came in and were fitted to the grid. And where they would not fit, the grid got 2 more rows, and the ideas got trimmed. Underneath all of it was the river, and what the river taught. That the world goes away and comes back. That the flood recedes and returns. That the sun dies every evening in the west, and is reborn every morning in the east. That the correct response to disorder is not to invent something new, but to restore what is supposed to be there. They built an entire civilization on the assumption that the pattern comes back around. For 3,000 years, they were right